Tamron's Top 5.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm professional photographer and Tamron National Technical Representative Jeff Allen. I'm here to share with you today 5 of my recent favorite photos. They may not be my 5 all time, but of photos I've made recently, these are ones that I've actually gone the extra step to print, frame, and even hang on the wall at home. There's a good tip for you. Save those best images and make prints from them. They don't have an off switch. They also make great gifts. Anyway, enough about that. Welcome to my presentation. This is actually one of my runner up photos. A little background behind the image, because even though a picture can tell 1,000 words, sometimes it needs 1,000 words of description as well. I was watching airplanes at an air show, and the air show had closed down. The planes were being put away for the evening, and a little thunderstorm was rolling by across the background in the distance. And I have a device I use called the lightning bug from MK Controls. And there are a number of lightning detectors that are available on the market. This was one of the early ones. I'm an early adopter, and it's always served me pretty well. It allows you to attach the device to your camera, and it senses the infrared burst of light before the actual visible lightning happens. That's enough time for it to trigger your camera to open the shutter and make the exposure as the lightning flashes in the visible spectrum. It's a really handy tool that allows me to make lightning photographs any time of the day or night much more easily than without an assisted device. You can't just press the shutter button and hope for the best. The lightning moves at the speed of light. Your finger and shutter do not. So, back to the exposure. I was actually standing on the back of my pickup truck to get over the fence in the foreground because, again, the airfield was closed to the public at the time. And I set the tripod up, made a manual exposure of the sky because the backlit clouds and the rain shower and the thunder and lightning in the distance were just really beautifully lighting up with the setting sun behind them. Made that exposure, which turned out to be an 80th of a second at f11 at ISO 400. So from there, I was using the Tamron 18 to 400 millimeter Di2 VC HLD lens. That's a lot, but it basically means it's a lens that will work on cameras that have crop sensors. And that's the majority of the consumer cameras out today. I'll talk about using it on a full frame camera later in the presentation, but for now, this was made on a crop sensor camera. So tripod, composed the shot the way I wanted, about 30 millimeters focal length measured on the lens, and got the scene happening. But what was happening was the lightning was mostly happening out of the frame, camera right, or just at the edge of the frame, camera right. I didn't want to change my composition, so I just had to be patient and wait and hope that the lightning, even though the storm was moving off to the right, might still have a little of energy in the area of my frame. And after dozens of shots, I got lucky and the lightning flickered right above and behind the airfield. So this became my keeper. And I have several shots that I made where lightning is off on the right hand side of the frame, and those look pretty cool too. But this is the one that really made it for me. That's one of my runners up. So as we continue on, here's a second runner up, and then we'll get to my favorite 5. I live in northern Colorado. I fly regularly for work out of the Denver airport. And near the Denver airport is the Rocky Mountain Arsenal National Wildlife Reserve. It, back in the day, was a weapons storage facility depot, and they made nerve gas, which fortunately they don't do anymore, and it's been deconditioned and turned into a wildlife preserve. It's a big piece of property. There've always been deer and coyotes and birds and things like that running around. But many years ago, they brought in a bison herd, which has proliferated and multiplied and makes for great photos. The bison have the run of the place. There is a road through it, and visitors are allowed to drive through, not get out of their car, of course, while they're taking photos of the bison, because they are still wild animals, more or less. This was shot leaning on the car window one afternoon as I was on my way to the airport for an afternoon flight. The bison were out lazily grazing, beautiful clouds in the sky, and just a very simple shot. I made this with the Tamron 28-75 Di3 RXD lens. That's a lens that's designed for Sony mirrorless cameras, so like the A7s, A9s, A5000 and 6000 series. The older NEX cameras will all accept this lens. Beautiful full frame lens, so it'll work on full frame or crop sensor cameras, and it just does a great job for me. Beautiful dynamic range, as you'll see in the next photograph as well. So remember that great photo opportunities don't have to be necessarily even at bucket list places or places that you've had to drive or fly hours and halfway around the continent or across the world to get to. A lot of great photo opportunities can happen right near where you are. The next photo is a good example, and this is one of my first of my 5 favorites at the moment. I made this at the Wisconsin State Capitol in Madison, Wisconsin. It's truly a people's house. When I went to photo scout this for a workshop that I was going to be teaching the following day, I took a minimal amount of gear with me, emptied all my pockets, left everything that was not necessary for the shoot kind of hidden in the trunk of the car, and walked in the door. And in Wisconsin, they believe that it's the people's house. There's no guards at the door. There's no metal detector that you go through, as often happens in most public buildings these days. Now, this was in fall of 2019. Things could have changed by now, but at least when I was there, you could pretty much walk in and there are it's just like a normal public building. You have fairly good freedom of access. Beautiful architecture inside, beautiful artwork. This shot was made pointing the new 17 to 28 millimeter Di3 RXD lens, also for Sony mirrorless cameras, almost straight up at the top of the Capitol Dome. Now again, the camera's dynamic range is fantastic. This is pretty much a straight out of the camera shot. No manipulation other than basic levels adjustments, no photoshopping or anything of the sort. This is how good the lens performs on a camera that has fantastic dynamic range of the sensor. You'll notice how rectilinear everything is, straight lines even at the edges stay straight. I shot this on a tripod, of course, and I shot at ISO 800 for a 30th of a second, and this was at f4 on the lens, so fairly wide open, and I shot at 17 millimeters. So taking in the full scope of what the lens is capable of for architecture, it's an absolutely wonderful lens, and this became an instant favorite. I knew as I was reviewing the image on the camera screen that it was going to be a keeper. And moving on to our next image, if you've followed me for any length of time or you've seen me giving presentations around the country, this image has been in my rotation for a couple of years now since I captured it originally. Again, some of the best images can happen in your backyard, and this is literally the case with this shot. I live in northern Colorado, and there's a large colony of great blue herons that live near where I live. I'd been following them going hunting every afternoon and found where they were landing in a wetland area not far from my home. As a result, when I was off the road from doing my normal travel for the company, I found that the herons were out in the same wetland area every afternoon about the same time. So I would go out and try and capture photos of them, only to be frustrated because the wetland area is right next to a busy county road. And when I would get there, pulling off the highway, the tires rolling onto the gravel shoulder would startle the birds. Sometimes it would change their behavior. Sometimes they would fly away, and I didn't want to disturb their hunting. So I finally figured, after a few weeks of frustration, that what I needed to do was get there before they did, so that I wasn't making any noise. I was part of the background. I wasn't disturbing them in any way. So this is kind of a pro tip if you're following animals around. Look at their behaviors, where they go, what they do, and try and anticipate, get there before they arrive, or move quietly into their realm. So that's what I finally did. Got there early, set up the tripod on the side of the road, although I ended up actually not using my tripod, and this was a handheld shot. I knew about where the birds were coming from their nest area, so I knew what direction they were going to be coming from, and I give myself plenty of time to do some test shots to get my exposure correct. And what I ended up finding was that, because I knew it was going to be backlit, and you can see the sun nicely backlighting the heron's bill and giving it that beautiful orange fluorescent look, that I was going to need to compensate my exposure. And in doing my testing, I ended up having to set an exposure compensation of plus 1.3 stops. So I'm actually overexposed by 1 1/3 stops in this image. My final exposure, and of course, unless you were standing next to me on that day, exposure is just a guideline, because your exposure will be different in a similar situation even if you're stalking the same bird in my neighborhood. But in this occasion, it was 1/320th of a second at f11 at ISO 400, and I had dialed in that plus 1.3 stops of exposure compensation. If you don't know how to use exposure compensation on your camera, check with your camera body maker's instruction manual. I'm sure there's instructions there to do it, or on their social media, YouTube website or something. They'll probably have a tutorial or a brief explanation as to how to look for and find the exposure compensation on your camera, because it varies from model to model, even within a brand. And then you'll be able to experiment with it in your own backyard or photo outings. So at any rate, I had everything fall into place, set the camera on continuous frame shooting, set my focus points on, in this case, a small group. My camera allows me to have spot focus or small group, or the bigger and bigger and bigger groups of focus points. I find I rarely use the big groups of focus points. I want the camera to do the focus where I want it to be. So in this case, I used the small group so that I could keep the bird more or less centered in the frame, but have it slightly offset, because I wanted to give it a little leading line. You'll notice there's a little room to the right of the animal where it has visual space to move into in the finished image. And this is always important when you're photographing things that are moving. Give them some space to move into also. So got lucky with this. Started firing as the bird was approaching. I zoomed out to 600 millimeters on the Tamron 150 to 600 G2 lens. Started firing and followed it using follow focus and panning with it all the way in until it landed. Just before it touched down was the shot that I felt in reviewing my image. That was the keeper. And I had that beautiful backlight. I had light coming up from those reeds that you can see on the ground to illuminate the underside of the bird, so I got great exposure on the feathers on the underside of the bird. Great exposure of its eye by using that exposure compensation. And the wings, I got lucky. There's no real photo manipulation here either. The blue from the sky literally at that particular moment reflected that color blue off of the top of the bird's wings. So again, a lot of planning and a lot of anticipation and a lot of patience went into making this shot, but in the end, it made for I think a fantastic exposure. And again, it's one of those photos that I've printed and framed and enlarged and put up on my wall. And I will take a moment, if I haven't already, to tell you it's really important to print your best photos. Make sure that they get to see the light of day on a regular basis and not just on the computer from time to time. Make prints. Give them as gifts. Photographs that you've made are fantastic gifts for family and friends too. And the nice thing about prints is they don't have an off switch. They don't go away in a second or two when you swipe left or swipe right and go to the next social post. So printed photos are still a great thing to have. And even make prints, just small prints of your everyday outings, and put them in photo albums so that your kids and your grandkids will be able to look at them down the road. Prints have much better archival permanence than your hard drive or whatever storage media you're using. And you think about, if you've been in personal computing for any length of time, how many different times you've changed storage medium from floppy disks to CDs to maybe DVDs to hard drives to thumb drives, whatever. It's going to be difficult to impossible for your kids or your grandkids in 10, 20 years, 50 years to be able to find those images and to have even a device that's capable of firing them up and opening them. So prints give you that permanence like nothing else does. So step off the soapbox and back into the photos. Here's another of my 5 favorites. I was at an air show in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, doing workshops, teaching, and also photographing aircraft. The host group at the airport had a charity hangar dance the night before the air show, and we were able to get access to the aircraft, a select few of the aircraft inside and just outside a hangar late afternoon and into the early evening. And it gave the ability for, with a paid admission, to get in and have access to basically step right up to airplanes with a limited access of the ability of having very small crowds around me. So paying for something like that, if you have the opportunity in any kind of shooting situation to get early access or limited access to something that you want to photograph without big crowds around, always worth maybe spending a few extra dollars on. At any rate, I made this photo with the Tamron 15 to 30 millimeter DI VC G2 lens, and this lens has Tamron's VC stabilization built in, so it allows you in situations like this where I was moving pretty quick, handheld shot again, to be able to get positioned, get set, and shoot at a fairly low shutter speed. The light wasn't great. It was just light spilling out from the inside of the hangar and a couple of floodlights on the ramp illuminating the aircraft. And as you can see, the people that had set up the display had gone out and gotten some small battery-operated LED lights to light the aircraft from underneath. And that was the perfect addition. I didn't need to try and add any additional light of my own. And this is a great thought for your own photography at night or in lower light situations, regardless of the subject matter. These were simple, inexpensive battery-operated LEDs that they'd gotten at a hardware store or home improvement store or something, and brought out and just set up to show off the underside of the aircraft. But it was absolutely perfect for my needs, and you could certainly do this yourself, again, in your own shooting situations. And the tail of the tape here, in terms of exposure, I was shooting at ISO 1600 handheld again, at f8 at 15 millimeters, all the way wide on the 15 to 30 millimeter lens. You can tell it's tack sharp at that point. I wanted f8 so that I could carry a little bit of depth of field through the scene. I wanted to make sure that everything from the near part of the frame to the background was in sharp focus. And at 15 millimeters, f8 gave me a pretty good depth of field to be able to perform that with. And the ending exposure for shutter speed was 1/15 of a second. And the VC, the vibration compensation in that lens, what Tamron calls, that's Tamron's name for stabilization, gave me a fantastic job of giving me a tack sharp image. I didn't have to worry about camera shake, even with a fairly slow shutter speed. Now, of course, wide angles give you more ability to shoot at slower shutter speeds before camera shake becomes an issue, but I definitely wanted to engage the VC to make sure that I had an absolutely tack sharp image. Now, just to show you, the reason this image is black and white, of course, is I'm photographing a vintage subject, and I did a little bit of sepia tone to it in post. Most of my images I do little, if any, manipulation to, because I want to show off what the Tamron lens is capable of doing, not my skills in post-production. But in this case, the image really screamed for having a black and white conversion. So I did so, and again added that wee bit of sepia just for comparison. Here's the original shot, originally framed, originally cropped in color, and you can see still it's a great photo. I have that beautiful cobalt blue of the late evening sky. The LED lights have a reasonably accurate color rendition index, so they made for a pretty good overall color balance of the shot. But I knew in my head, again, this is one of those pre-planning things. I go back way back in photography and shot film and did my own black and white and some color processing and printing way back in my early days. But I always think in both color and black and white consciously when I'm out shooting, especially when I'm thinking of a vintage subject like an old World War II era aircraft. That black and white conversion is just going to make the image really work out well. And the added contrast of the black and white, and I did punch the contrast up just a smidgen to really make it pop, makes all the difference in the world. So that was a fun image to create. And again, limited access in a situation like that, in a museum or a gallery situation or an air show or a car show or anything like that, if you can maybe pay a few bucks extra to get early or late access, usually a good investment if you want your photos to be free of people. And honestly, I'm more of a landscape, nature, product kind of shooter where people aren't necessarily going to be elements in my shots. So in a situation like this, where the next day at the airfield, of course, there were throngs of people surrounding the aircraft, this gave me the ability to, without having to do long exposures or a lot of post processing to take people out of the shot, I was able to get the shot without people in it. Moving along to our next image. This is another photograph where some planning and preparation and also a happy accident occurred at a junction point. The photograph was made just outside of Burlington, Vermont. As I was driving into Burlington on the freeway, I noticed that there were these giant whale tail sculptures in a big berm at the edge of a park. And I thought, well, that would be cool, but at the time it was raining cats and dogs, and I was on my way to do a presentation, so I didn't think much about it. But the presentation went off, and the second half of the presentation was going to be a sunset shoot at a nearby lake. It was still raining and cloudy, so that half of the workshop ended up being canceled. So we kind of went our separate ways and grabbed a bite to eat, went back to the hotel, and I got busy with another project. And after a period of time, my colleague that was with me called me and said, "Hey, have you looked outside lately?" And I said, "No," because I was still thinking it was pouring rain. And he said, "Go to the window and check it out." I did, and it turned out that the rain had stopped, the clouds had cleared out, and it was turning out to be a fairly nice-looking starry night. And he said, because we had talked about seeing these sculptures on the way into town, he said, "So you want to go out and do some night shots?" And I said, Yeah, that'll be fun. I knew that the Milky Way would be coming up, and Mars was also very bright. You can see that as that small dot in the lower portion of the center of the frame. So I thought this could make for some interesting photos. So we got together a little later, geared up, and found our way to the park at the edge of town where the sculpture was, and it was being redeveloped into some ball fields. So there were clods of dirt and everything torn up in the field. Fortunately, I had remembered to bring my headlamp along, so I had a flashlight and I could also see the controls on my camera that way. And it was invaluable in not breaking our necks getting out to the sculptures by having a little extra flashlight with us, because it was dark out there. And that's something you always want to be prepared when you do night sky photography, to bring all the tools along that you're going to need, including flashlights or headlamps and things like that, so that you can see where you're going on the way to your location where you're setting up and you don't fall and get hurt, and so that you also have a little light to be able to set controls on your camera. Now, it's not a bad idea in a perfect situation, and this was a last minute call, but in a perfect situation for night sky photography, you'll already have your camera set up basically and ready to go. In this case, I didn't, because I was using it for teaching earlier, but I was able to set things up in the field and get going. Kind of a fun shot here. As you can see, the sculpture, the berm that the whale tail sculpture is in, is right next to the freeway. Those streaks at the lower right hand corner of the frame are headlights and taillights and marker lights on cars and trucks going by. The whale tails are backlit very nicely. You have a nice little rim light there, made possible by the headlights of the cars approaching from behind them. So the light was kind of nice. It painted in a little bit on the foreground. You can see what's going on in the foreground, and also this is a great example of how you can do night sky photography in a suburban or urban situation and still get some reasonably good night sky. It's certainly not going to be that deep dark black sky with the pinpoints of light that you would get if you were in a dark sky area, but you can make reasonably good night sky images if you have a great foreground in a situation like this. So the Milky Way was there, Mars was there, and just a kind of a fun shot overall to have made. But it also, again, is a teachable thing. You don't have to go out into the wilderness to necessarily find those great dark night sky shots. You can do them in your neighborhood, or a nearby park, and come up with some reasonable things. Now, the exposure was on a tripod, of course. I used the camera self timer because I didn't have a remote release available. 20 seconds. At f4 at ISO 1600. Now, at 28 millimeters, 20 seconds is really about as long as you can go without having the stars start to look streaky or take on tails because of the motion of the Earth relative to the stars. There's a good formula that I learned from one of my Tamron Tech Team colleagues, and that if you want to determine the longest shutter speed you can use with whatever focal length you're using, you divide the focal length into 500, and that'll give you the resulting time. So for instance, if you had a 50 millimeter lens, you'd only be able to shoot for 10 seconds. So that would require a much larger lens opening, a much higher ISO. So a wider angle lens certainly, and the wider you can go certainly, is going to lend itself very well to getting better night sky shots with lower ISOs and longer shutter speeds before you have to worry about the planetary movement taking away the pinpoints of light. So moving along to the final image of my favorite five. Planning and luck and calculating and guessing had a lot to do with making this shot as well. It was at an air show in Fort Worth, and I had been watching the moon all week as it was coming up later and later, setting later and later. The moon rises when it's in its cycle about 40 minutes later every day. And it also, of course, sets 40 minutes later. So this was the second day of the air show, and based on where I was seeing the aircraft demonstrations happening on day one of the air show, I thought there was a pretty good possibility that having the moon 20 minutes further down into the sky, the second day of the air show, I might be able to have a plane fly in front of the moon before it set for the day, and indeed that happened. So airshow photography is always challenging because you're photographing subjects that are moving 2, 3, 4, 500, maybe 600 miles an hour, as was the case of this F-16 demonstration team that you're seeing in the aircraft in the photo. It took a lot of shots, and again, this is a situation where having a camera with a high-speed capture rate is very important. I used a small group focus again on this rather than a single spot because I was shooting handheld, and it was hard to keep the plane centered in the photograph, so it's important to use those small groups, and that way you have a little bit of extra leeway for the subject moving around within your frame. It took a lot of shots to get this, and again, it was planning and calculation and a stroke of good luck to get the plane just flying right in front of the moon there. And believe it or not, even with the camera I was using, which has a 10 frame a section capture rate, the plane was moving so fast that the previous frame to this, it was way out. You couldn't even see the moon in the frame. And the shot just after this, the plane was already past the moon visibly in the sky. But this one was the keeper. It's good when you go to air shows or follow any kind of subject motion to learn what they're going to be doing. Birds fly and even small insects tend to fly in the same patterns over and over. Pilots do the same thing at an air show. They rehearse their shows and they fly the same routines day after day. That way, when the air show comes around, they're going to be giving the crowd the best performance, and they don't crash, which is always, in their best interest too. So anyway, a camera with a fast capture rate was very handy. In this case, I was using an unusual combination. I was using the Tamron 18 to 400 millimeter lens, which is a lens designed for crop sensor cameras, which are the APS-C sensors, the kind of sensors that most commonly are used in consumer cameras. That day, however, I was trying out for the first time a new Nikon Z6 camera, which has their new mirrorless lens mount. So in order to put my existing Nikon mount lens on, I had to use their adapter. The advantage of using the adapter is, even though this is a lens that's traditionally used on crop sensor cameras, because it stands off of the lens further, it gives me full frame performance at nearly every focal length, and it works quite well with that camera, I've discovered over time. At any rate, this was brand new to me. This is a really high-speed capture camera. I can shoot 10 or more frames a second with it, and it allowed me to, again, follow focus with the plane as it went through its routine, and I was just firing away to get the shots, and it's still a matter of anticipation and perspiration and luck and planning all coming together at the same juncture. Another thing that's important about this shot, my original frame, this is a cropped image. The original frame was horizontal rather than vertical. I felt that the vertical crop made for a better composition. Also, it's fairly well cropped. This is probably a 50 or 60% crop from the original frame. Another advantage of shooting with full frame cameras and larger pixel capacity sensors is that if you do need to crop a photo in post, if your lens just can't get you physically close enough, or you can't get physically close enough to the subject, the ability to crop is another fantastic benefit of modern cameras with high pixel capacity sensors. So that's another thing to consider. Also important in this particular shot, I was shooting ISO 800 at 1/1000th of a second so that I could freeze the aircraft in motion. I was panning with it and keeping it centered in the frame as best I could, shooting at f8, so I had a little bit of depth of field forgiveness out of the lens at 400 millimeters, and also because it was a light-colored subject against a pretty bright blue sky, I also used the exposure compensation of plus 0.7, so I opened up 2/3 of a stop beyond what the camera's meter thought was correct. That gave me the correct exposure too. So that's it. That's my top 5 plus a couple of runners up. I hope you've enjoyed my presentation today. Thanks for joining me. Again, you can follow me on social media. I'm Tamron Tech Jeff, and thanks for watching.